Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something pretty big, shaking up global trade and politics. Just this past Wednesday, President Trump really doubled down on his push for massive tariffs. We're talking potentially up to 100% on countries like China and India. The reason, they're still buying Russian oil.
Right. The immediate goal seems pretty straightforward. Put the financial screws on Putin, basically. Try and force an end to the war in Ukraine.
But, it's getting much more complicated than just that. This isn't only about geopolitics somewhere else. It's kicked off this huge global debate and even kind of a rethink within conservative circles right here.
We're already seeing reactions fly. Beijing shot back almost immediately, calling it unfair pressure.
Yeah, and India. They're already dealing with some pretty hefty tariffs from earlier this year.
Yeah.
And now, well, the savings they made on cheap Russian oil could turn into a massive new expense.
Exactly. So the big question is this a smart play? A way to corner rivals, maybe bring jobs home?
Or is it a huge gamble? Could it totally reshape global power in ways we don't expect? So today we're cutting through the noise to understand how this one tariff threat is shaking up global trade, challenging alliances, and maybe even redefining what being conservative means today.
That's the plan. And we've got some good sources to draw on. Newsweek, the European conservative, plus insights from the Daily Wire and the Heritage Foundation. They all why these tariffs are on the table, how places like China and India are pushing back, and what it all means, for global power, for free markets, the whole 9 yards. Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with President Trump's strategy then. This idea of up to 100% tariffs on Russian oil buyers. What's the explicit aim?
Well, like you said, the stated goal, straight from President Trump, is to financially choke Putin's war effort. Try to force an end to the war in Ukraine. It's direct economic pressure.
And it's not just talk, right? There's already been action.
No, definitely not just talk. Remember, the U.S. already hiked tariffs on India quite a bit back in August, and there was a specific penalty, 25%, tied directly to their Russian oil buys.
So the intent is clear. Discourage those purchases.
Absolutely. It shows they're serious about using tariffs as a tool here.
Okay, but what's the thinking behind it? Especially from a conservative viewpoint. It feels like a pretty aggressive move, maybe unconventional.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting. If you look at Trump's own statements and analysis from places like the Heritage Foundation, you see a couple of key justifications. One big one is this idea that tariffs can rejigger the balance of trade, as Trump puts it, basically bring manufacturing back to the U.S., create American jobs.
That sounds like the Maganomics idea, the America First economic vision.
Exactly. It's part of that. Even things like a weaker dollar, which can sometimes result from tariffs, get framed as a plus, a way to boost exports, create jobs here. It's all about economic independence, prioritizing American industry.
Okay, that's one angle. What else?
The other key justification, and you hear this particularly from Heritage, is about strategic negotiation. The argument is these threats aren't just punishments, they're leverage.
Leverage to do what?
To get countries to the negotiating table. The potential end game, as they see it, could be striking bilateral deals. Deals designed to maybe peel nations like India, Japan, and Australia out of China's sphere of influence.
So isolating the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party.
That seems to be a major underlying goal, yes. So it's not just trade policy in a vacuum. It's tied into a much bigger geopolitical strategy aimed at strengthening America's position relative to China.
Right, and that really brings it home how these global policies, these tariff decisions, can actually ripple down and affect, your choices. What things cost, job prospects.
Absolutely. Things you buy, electronics, clothes, and maybe job opportunities in manufacturing here. That's the intended connection anyway. The aim is to benefit American workers and families, even if it means shaking up the old ways of doing trade.
But moves like this don't happen without pushback. And we're seeing it, right? Especially from China.
Oh, yeah. China reacted strongly. Just recently, their foreign ministry spokesman, Lin Zhan, basically slammed the tariff reports, called them unfair pressure.
And they're saying they're not part of the Ukraine crisis.
Exactly. He said, China is neither the creator of this crisis nor a party to it. They're trying to maintain this position of neutrality despite, their pretty significant economic links to Russia.
But are they actually cutting back on Russian energy because of this pressure?
Well, the data suggests not really. Reports from July showed China was still Russia's biggest fossil fuel customer. We're talking something like 42% of Russia's monthly earnings from its top buyers. That's huge. around $7.2 billion.
Wow, 7.2 billion in 1 month.
Yeah. So despite the pressure, despite the rhetoric, the energy trade continues. It shows how deep those economic ties run, and frankly, how hard it is to completely isolate Russia economically when a buyer like China steps in.
Okay, what about India? You mentioned they're also facing tariffs. How are they reacting?
India's also pushed back hard. They've called the tariffs unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable, especially, they argue, for an ally. They also point out, look, other countries are still buying Russian energy too, including some in Europe.
And what's the actual cost for India looking like? You mentioned it could wipe out their savings.
That's what the estimates suggest. So India saved maybe around $17 billion buying that cheaper Russian crude, which sounds great. But now experts figure these new tariffs could cost India an extra $37 billion next fiscal year.
An extra 37 billion, so way more than they saved.
Way more. It completely flips the script for them economically. What looked like a smart buy could become a huge liability. And you have to wonder, does that push them further away from the U.S. strategically, or maybe closer to groups like the SKO?
The SKO,
Yeah.
the Shanghai Cooperation Organization,
Yeah.
with Russia and China.
Right. And that's the surprising thing. Just last week, Prime Minister Modi was meeting with Putin and Xi Jinping at the SCO summit, cementing those ties.
Yeah, I saw President Trump express concern about that, something like, we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China.
It raises that tricky point, doesn't it? Sometimes economic pressure doesn't pull countries apart. It can actually push them closer together in unexpected ways.
It really makes you rethink how these global relationships work. It's complex.
Definitely forces a recalculation for the U.S. and its allies. The ripple effects are potentially enormous.
Now, you also mentioned this is stirring things up internally with inconservative thought. How are people squaring these tariffs with traditional free market ideas?
That's a really key part of the story. You look at analysis from groups like the American Action Forum, and they talk about a shift in right-of-center ideology.
A shift how?
Well, traditionally, economic conservatives lean towards free markets, fewer tariffs. Tariffs are often seen as distorting the market, maybe inefficient. So this kind of broad imposition of tariffs, as they call it, feels like a move away from that, more towards maybe command and control economics, which isn't usually associated with the right.
But there are prominent conservatives supporting this, right?
Oh, absolutely. Ben Shapiro at the Daily Wire, for example, kind of lays out the dilemma. He basically asks, are you comparing Trump's policies to some perfect free market ideal, or are you comparing them to the likely alternatives?
Alternatives like,
Quote, massive taxation, massive overregulation. From that perspective, many see Trump's overall approach, even with tariffs they might not love in theory, as much, much better. It's framed as choosing the practical good over an unattainable perfect.
so a pragmatic argument.
Very much so. And there's a strong national security element woven in. Shapiro and others really emphasize the need to, quote, box in China.
How do tariffs fit into that?
Well, it's part of a broader strategy. For instance, arguing against selling advanced tech, like certain NVIDIA chips, to China because of data security concerns, think BYD cars, TikTok. And interestingly, this perspective might even argue for lowering tariffs on allies like India, South Korea, Japan, not necessarily for pure free trade reasons, but to build a stronger, united front against China.
So using trade policy very strategically, almost like a weapon.
Or at least a key tool in the geopolitical toolkit, yes. It's about prioritizing national security and maybe domestic industry over strict adherence to free trade doctrine.
Which shows, that even within an ideology like conservatism, there's a real active debate happening.
Yeah.
It's not monolithic. It's about how best to protect American interests in a world that's, well, pretty complicated.
Absolutely. And it signals that maybe national security and industrial policy are becoming much bigger priorities, potentially leading to a lasting shift in conservative economic thinking.
Now, this isn't just a U.S., China, India thing, is it? Europe's involved, or at least being asked to get involved.
Right. President Trump directly appealed to European leaders, urged them to slap those 100% tariffs on India and China too, saying the U.S. would match whatever they did.
And how is Europe responding?
Publicly. Silence from Brussels so far. But behind the scenes, you hear a lot of concern. Critics are warning that joining in would drag Europe into a trade war.
Which they probably don't want, given their own economic issues.
Yeah. Exactly. They're worried about hitting consumers with potentially hyperinflation and medication shortages, damaging long-term trade deals. Europe's already dealing with inflation, high energy costs. Cutting off potentially cheaper imports is a really tough sell.
And isn't there a bit of irony here? Isn't the EU still buying Russian energy itself?
Well, that's the surprising bit, yes. Despite everything, the EU still imports a lot of Russian natural gas. In July, it was over 67% of some fossil fuel purchases from Russia, and that gas isn't sanctioned.
Really? So they're still buying Russian gas, but being asked to tariff others who buy Russian oil.
It highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Fully cutting those economic ties is incredibly difficult. Even when there's political pressure, they're trying to walk a very fine line.
And then you have Russia itself. Moscow is saying these sanctions aren't even working.
Yeah, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov basically claims years of U.S. sanctions have had no effect whatsoever on their economy. Now, you have to take that with a grain of salt, obviously. But here's the paradox. India, buying so much Russian oil, nearly 40% of Russia's exports, apparently has actually helped stabilize the global oil market. It's acted as a critical market stabilizing mechanism.
How so?
By soaking up that Russian supply, it's prevented global oil prices from potentially spiking up to, say, $150 a barrel. So in a weird way, India's purchases, which the tariffs are targeting, have maybe helped keep global energy prices from going even higher.
Wow, that really complicates the narrative that these policies are straightforwardly hurting Russia without side effects.
It absolutely does. And the potential broader fallout is significant. We saw market volatility spike back in April, remember, when another round of tariffs had a bit of a botched rollout. It led to one of the most volatile months in stock market history.
Which hits people's investments, their retirement accounts?
Directly. And beyond market jitters, there's the risk this could empower anti-Western blocs, like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It could push them closer together, challenge the U.S.-led global order. So the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've got President Trump's tariff push, aiming to hit Russia's war funding and maybe more broadly, reshape global trade in an America-first way.
Right. But it's facing serious pushback from China and India, who see it as unfair economic pressure. And the costs for India especially look like they could actually backfire strategically.
And internally here at home, it's forcing this debate within conservative circles, pitting traditional free market ideas against rising concerns about national security and domestic jobs.
Exactly. While it challenges old doctrines, many conservatives seem to be justifying it on those national security and bring jobs home grounds. A pragmatic shift, perhaps.
And the final outcome, it really seems to hang in the balance, especially what Europe decides to do. This could seriously disrupt the global economy, shake up alliances, or maybe create whole new power dynamics.
It really forces you, the listener, to think about just how interconnected everything is: trade, diplomacy, security. One move can send ripples everywhere.
So here's something to chew on. Thinking about all these huge economic and geopolitical stakes, is using tariffs like this a necessary, maybe unconventional tool to protect national interests, maybe even promote peace in the long run? Or does it risk breaking the world into competing economic camps, making everyone ultimately less secure and less prosperous?